Good morning. It is Wednesday, and it is Vod Elul, the sixth day in the month of Elul. Three kapitlach would be Tazan Yitzayin and Ches. And as I already announced, the summer learning of Sheresh Mitzvah Tefillah has passed. Yesterday we learned to complete Maimed. Hayu Yamim Tovim Chamisha Asav. And I'm using the last couple of days. I don't know yet what's going to be tomorrow, but I'm using the last couple of days to pay bills. This is a little bit funny, but this is the halacha says that the teacher gets to choose what to teach a student all year long, and therefore the student is working for him, and that's why the halachas of all of Ime would work. So the teacher's advantage. Yom Tov time, the teacher has to teach what the student needs to learn, the halachas of Yom Tov, and therefore the teacher is working for the students, and the halachas of all of Ime would work to the advantage of the students. So this is a bill. I'm paying a bill. This is a Maimed Kimiresh Surim from Pachas Bala, which we learned probably 4 or 5 weeks ago. I remember sitting here in this seat in my basement, teaching this Maimed. It was in the time when we kept flip-flopping back and forth between being and Shul and not being, and Shul was a Friday morning. We gave the class in the house, but I skipped a Pedic. Why did I skip a Pedic? Because it's very difficult. So I'm now going to revisit this Pedic and do it now. And if you're listening, I know somebody that's listening, first of all, you probably remember when we started. Second of all, it's not going to matter that much because to a very great extent, this class is going to be self-contained. It's going to stand on its own legs. So this is a Maim from Pashas Balak, which is one of the 4 nevuos that Bilam HaRasha says he's hoping to curse the Jewish people, to bring Ayin Hod into the Jewish people, and then, of course, to delay the blessings coming to the Jewish people. But in the final analysis, some of the nicest things anybody ever said about the Jew prophetically was said by this gigantic Rosh, Bilam. And the first one begins by going into our past. We come from Heilik Ezedis. So the Maimon made several points. The first point was that the Avis and the Mois are bestowed with many, many blessings. Each one of the Avis has different blessings, and all told, all together, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yankov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, bring us multiple blessings, many, many, many blessings. Then the Rebbe said, since we are the descendants of Reish, Tzurim, and Boys, you have to say that every single Maila that the Avis had and the Mois had, the Jewish people inherit, which is very interesting. Then the Maimah said that if you have all the Mailas of the Avis and the Mois, you must say that these Mailas begin in the Shedesh Makam. In other words, it's not only down here in this world that Jewish people suddenly have a variety of different attributes, Mailas, but that these Mailas exist in their Shedesh Makam, that this is the root and the source where you didn't come from, Reish Tzurim. The voice Hashem Ulamaila of Midas, Malchus, Chochmah, Bina, and even higher, those Mailas already exist. And then the last thing that Rebbe said, that the point is to manifest, to bring down those Mailas from the Ruchniyizdika levels, from the Ruchniyizdika worlds, to the Gashmiyizdika level of the Gashmiyizdika world. And of course, to bring it from a higher level to a lower level, you have to go even higher. Like Avraham Avinu had to be given an extra hay to go down from being Avram, Sechel, and Ela, Mikol Raya, to come down and to be Mashpi in the lowest world. So 3 points. Number 1, every mile of obviously Mois had, you didn't have. Number 2, you didn't have these miles also in the Shedesh Makam, the mile of Svidis. Number three, to bring it from the higher levels to the lower levels means going even higher. Those are 3 points of this Maimed. They may be the 3 points of this Maimed, but it's certainly the 3 points that we're going to need in order to learn this Shir. Now, at the end of that Maimed, they want to talk about the Rebbe Dayat's 5 second test. So that's how the Maimed, so to speak, fills out, if you're allowed to use such a word. So we skipped Pei Gimel of the Maimed. It's a safe Maimon Tafshan Lamed Ches. If you have it, bottom of page Shinai and Beis, and page Shinai and Gimel. If you're listening to me and you want to follow inside, please go to the website, intachassidus.org. Go to the Maimorim page, go to the Rebbe Maimorim page, go to the 5738 page, and scroll down. I think it's Maimon 41. The PDF is there. You can open it, and you can read all my scribble. We're going to read Pei Gimel. What is Pei Gimel about? Pei Gimel is about the Shtalshalos. Pei Gimel is by bringing something from a higher level to a lower level. As the Rebbe said, that all the milas that the Jewish people have, they have not just down here, but they have in the Shadish Shabbat the Mila, the medius and Malchus and Bina and Chochma and Bina and so on. So in Pei Gimel, the Rebbe begins to discuss the idea of Shtalshalos, how things come from a higher level to a lower level. And the Rebbe does something very interesting. He chooses to use the path of Ishtalshalos Oisius, or otherwise known as Caleb. There's a lot of Maimorim that talk about Ishtalshalos. Let me really tell you. Atzilus, and there's Bria, there's Ein Sof, and there's Atzilus, there's Moichin, and there's Medius. There's so many Maimorim talk about Ishtalshalos. But when a Maimon discusses Ishtalshalos, as a rule, he'll talk about the Madreges. From Chochma to Bina, from Medius to Malchus, from Atzilus to Bria. And when you're speaking about the Madreges, you're speaking primarily about the Gilu, or the Oyer. The Oyer of Chochma coming into Bina, the Oyer of Moichin coming into Midas, the Oyer of Zohar coming into Malchus, the Oyer of Atzilus coming into Bria. The Rebbe chooses to talk about Oisius and Caleb, which is arguably less common. And if you look inside the Maimed, in the very first line, it says, "V'yuvan al pi hadugmois shemevim mizeh v'keiches hanefesh." There's many misholim to explain the faculties of the neshama, u'minyan Oisius, and the letters and words that carry those keiches. And then the Rebbe says, "Ulahoyer shebe'etz chayim," that in Kabbalah, that Izal, but sinu l'klolos in Yishtalshalos, l'klolos in Yishtalshalos, that in that Izal. When he wants to use the mashal for Yishtalshalos, Sfiris uses the mashal of Oisius, of Caleb. And you'll notice that this Ulahoyer has no maramot, there's no source, which means that, people who worked in these Maimorim research and try to find things. I'm sure they try to find the next time where this is written. I didn't find it. I've never studied Kabbalah. I'm no expert on Kisvi Arizal, but I know that in Hasidus, Oisius as a mashal for Ishtalshalos are much less frequently used than the mashal of Koiches, Svidus, and Oyer. And the Rebbe wants to give the impression that at least in the Arizal's writings, the classic mashal, the typical mashal, is the mashal of Oisius. So to me, to my humble way of thinking, this is a tzad of chinut, a tzad of beer, and there's a precision here. The Rebbe wants to explain the Shtalshalos from a higher level to a lower level. Every mile the others and the boys have, we have. We don't only have them we have them in our Sheder Shumbok. They come down from our Sheder Shumbok down into this world, just like Oisius come from a higher level to a lower level. The Rebbe is choosing using the mashal of Oisius rather than the mashal of Oyer, of Koiches, and there's a reason. Of course, I don't know the reason. I have some thoughts, and I'm actually not going to share them because they're very unsupportable. I don't know how to defend them. It's just a field that I have, so to speak. And that's why this makes this Maimon and this Pedic so unusual, where the Rebbe wants to use the mashal to explain the Shtalshalos, and he doesn't use the mashal of Chochma to Bina, but the Oisius of Chochma, the Oisius of Bina, how they go from one to the next, and so forth and so on. So what happens now is I give you a lecture on Oisius. That's how this becomes a class. I'm not just going to read and translate the page. I'm going to give you a lecture on Oisius. And I want to preface by saying that this spring and summer, this half year, because of quarantine, I've had opportunity to teach many Maimorim that otherwise would not have gotten an opportunity to teach. In other words, I smuggled in Chabad Eingegangen with Maimorim from different years, which I never taught, because I had this need to teach every single Maimor of the Rebbe. It's an obsession of mine. I hope that in time and Seichel I'll be able to do it successfully. So we learned a number of Maimorim from different years of the beginning of the Rebbe's Nesivos, including from Tafshin Yud Gimel from 1953. And one of the Maimorim was the Shavuos Maimon. And of course, the Maimon asked the standard questions and gave the unique answer. And of course, the question is, what does the Leimer mean if all the Jewish people were already present? And in that Maimon, the Leimer means Oasis. In other words, there's a Maimon we learned in the last 4 months, in which there is a more elaborate exploration of what the Rebbe would repeat. I guess it's 25 years later. Tafshin Lamed Ches, Tafshin Gimel, a difference of 25 years. Where he also built a Maimed around the idea of Oasis, but that Maimed Lached is based on Maimon of the earlier Kirabeim. This Maimed, it's hard to find a source on which this Maimed is based. It's very difficult to identify on what Maimed this Maimed is based, unless it's based on the Maimorim that he brings from Tokuf Samaches and the Mittler Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek and the Yuri Isaiah, which I did not have a chance to look up. So I'm telling you that we learned a similar sugya recently, and we're going to be repeating it now. So here comes my introduction. If you study Hasidus, you learn that Seder Ishtalshus has basically two paths, two channels, two systems. Basically, we would call them the oil system and the Keli system, light and vessel. And of course, in Atzmos, it's called Yocholte Elohoi, Yocholte Shalei Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's called Keich HaBeligim Keich HaGvul. In Tzimtzum, it's called Eid HaKav and Eisias HaRashima. In Seder Ishtalshus, it's called Eidus and Kelim. And in the human experience, it's called Neshama and goof. And both of these systems travel through the chain of Kav. There's only one chain. There's no two chains. There are two systems, but they parallel together. Like it says, Me'is Avos Ha'er and Asa Keli, the Keli emerges from the Eid HaKav. So the way the Eibush chose to create the world, there's one tziner, there's one pipe that delivers all that needs to be delivered through all the various different levels and roads of Seder Ishtalshus. But in that tziner, there are two different, distinct models that go back to Kvayachol Tilatzmis and Manash. And it's the Oyen model and the Oisias model. I would argue that 80 or 90% of Hasidus deals with the Oyer model, not with the Oisias model. In other words, for every Maimon that talks about Kalim, there's probably 10 Maimon that talk about Oyer. When I say Oyer, I don't mean Oyer, I mean Sfidus, I mean Koiches, Ruchnias. Which is why it's unusual for the Rebbe to choose in this Maimon the pathway of the Ishtalshus of Oisias, and moreover to assert that in Eitz Chaim, this is the standard mashal, the mashal of Oisias. What is the difference between the two systems? How does the oil system work, and how does the Kalim and Oisias system work? And the answer, of course, is that oil, light, life, is spiritual, and it operates in a way of dveikus and kiyuv, nachtos, and believable. In other words, if you have a lower oil and you include it in a higher oil, you don't now have two oils, you have one bigger oil. When you bring forward from a higher oil to a lower oil, the lower oil, koyachol, is revealed more, and therefore on a lower level than it is on the higher oil. But ultimately, the relationship between one oil and another oil, even if you're talking about the difference between an oil and seven, which is called oil, and an Ilma Mali, which is called Chayes, is that they're really the same. This is, you can find this in the Rebbe Sichos, based on what's written in Shadi Yichud Perek Yud, about Eira Shemesh B'Shemesh, as opposed to what's written in Perek Gimel, where he's talking about Dikul. Shadi Yichud. The Nefesh is one. From the Nefesh emerges all kinds of lights. But they're not really separate lights, they're part of the light of the Nefesh. And when a lower light, it goes up to a higher light, it becomes greater. It becomes one. Like, for example, if you have 2 matches or 5 matches, and you put the matches together, you'll have still 5 matches with one flame. The flames will join. The same is true with the oil system. Oil starts out as one. It's diversified and diverged because goof, keli holds them and separates them. But when they rejoin, they become one again. And the Kalim system is absolutely the opposite. And the root of it ultimately is a Losha from Alton Rebbe, which doesn't really say in Kabbalah. And like I said, when we learned the Mayim Tafshin Yud Gimel, I actually took out the Tzadik Vov, where the Rebbe's Mitzayin, and I looked at the Maramokim, he's Mitzayin to a Sefer Yetzirah, and to Kabbalah, and you realize this is a Chiddush of the Alton Rebbe, quote, HaNefesh Melaya Eizis, the soul is full of letters. What this means is that Klayachol, the infinity of Atzmos Amus, has two ideas. One infinity is a simple infinite plainness, it's the source of Oyer, Moed. And the other is literally an infinite diversity of types and infinite diversity of individual aspects of letters or bodies as they're included in Atzmos Amus. In other words, words come from the Etzem Neshama. And the parallel, the milos, they come from Atzmos Amus. Every sound, every word, every letter, on all levels, Tainu, Gratz, and Chokma, Bina, Midas, Malchus, Machshava, Dibur, Maiseh, Machshava, Dibur, he exists separately in the Etzem. The Etzem doesn't have a possibility for words that we actualize when we use them. The Etzem actually is full of an infinite number, of an infinite variety of different types of letters. When a person speaks, every word he says, that word, that letter that he speaks or thinks or feels, emerges directly from the Etzem HaNeshama as individual distinctive oisias. It manifests based on need and based on use, but in the Etzem HaNefesh, the oisias exist distinctively, separately. Like I mentioned to you in the last Maimed, that in Tafei Samachay and Shulis, which I haven't looked up, but this is how I remember it, when you speak about a lower light included in a higher light, you call it Hiyuli and Gila, or Elam and Gila, or Etzem and Espashtus. When you talk about lower letters being included in a higher world, it's called Klalapra. In other words, they exist individually in the source. When a person thinks, and then he speaks, the words of thought, or speech don't come from the words of thought, they come from the Etzem and the Neshama. So speech and thought are two different levels. They emerge through the chain from the thought to the speech. It looks like the letters of thought are creating the letters of speech. The bodies of thought are creating the bodies of speech. But in reality, they're really only delivering them, and their sources from Atzmos. In other words, when it says in Chassidus that that Kelim and Oisius emerge, when the light becomes less, there's less concentration of light, so more detail and form emerges, it's only that you see it at this point. But the source, the Shreidish Amakar of every Keli is directly in Atzmos. So Oid and Keli are very, very different in their source. All Oides in their source are one. All Kelim in their source are many, many in the levels of the Kelim, and many in the individual aspects of those Kelim as they're included in the Sheidish Shemot. Let me explain it a little bit better, a little bit different, a little bit more, another aspect. For something to exist, it has to have a definition. When I say for something to exist, it has to have a definition, I mean for something to exist separate from the Eibishter. Everything is God. But when you identify something as an entity unto itself, whether it's Kipshuta, Chalei Kipshuta, is not the point right now. And the Hebrew word to denote this is the word Metzias. If something exists as a Metzias, there has to be a definition to its Metzias. How it is separated from its environment, how it's separated from something other. And for this to be, you have to have a combination of a goof and a neshama. The neshama is the meaning and purpose of that entity, and the goof is the metzias, is the distinctness of that. Ideas, yeah? Ideas. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 2 is 4. Are they one idea or are they two ideas? So in pre-Monet, there are two ideas. In second grade, they become one idea because the child gets smarter. What makes it into two ideas, and what makes it into one idea is just how much oil you have in the understanding of it. When you have more oil, there's fewer oisias. When you have less oil, there's more oisias. But if there would be no words, if there would be no medium to carry the idea wouldn't exist. If you don't have words with which you can teach a child what the number one means, what the number one means again, and what the idea of addition means, and the idea of joining together to create a greater number the child could not learn. And the same is true in everything. In ideas and in reality, something exists because it has a body. But bodies alone are lumps of clay, right? They're goof and neshama, they're dead, they're lifeless. So the reality of everything is a combination of a soul and a body. Where does that soul come from? The Eibishter. Where does that body come from? The Eibishter. To say it in different words. Where does that soul come from? The Etzem and Neshama. Where does that body come from? The Etzem and Neshama. But they come in very different ways. Every soul of every creation, every idea, feeling, and sense, and every person are an expression of the soul of everything, or the Eibishter of the Etzem and Neshama. They emerge as individual spirits with individual limited definitions, but they come from the Etzem and Neshama. In the Etzem and Neshama, you don't have many spirits. You have one great spirit. And as you descend from a higher level to a lower level, an aspect, a diminished form of that spirit becomes the spirit to accommodate a certain medius that exists in reality or in some level and in some way. But the bodies that carry those spirits have to exist individually till Etzem and Nefesh. It isn't that in the Etzem and Neshama and the Etzem and Nefesh Lamaila, there's a theoretical possibility for bodies. That's how it's explained in Kabbalah and in Chassidus. In the Etzem, all the individual aspects of bodies that are going to exist later already exist. It's just that they emerge through Seder Ishtalshalos. So to summarize the second point, for something to be a mitzias, it needs to have a combination of a goof and a neshama. The neshama is an expression of etzem. The goof is an expression of etzem, but in very different ways. The neshama is an expression of etzem, that in etzem it is etzem. The goof is an expression of etzem, that in etzem it exists individually. It's just that it's very, very, very low. Now, there's a Maimon, Hemshech called Ranat, Tafresh and Test, which Yeshiva Bachanim learned, or used to learn. Not sure exactly why that Hemshech was chosen, because it's not one of the easiest ones, but that's what we learned to Shir Beis and Zal. In this Hemshech Ranat, the Rebbe Rashab discusses Oisius. And he talks about Oisius existing in Etzem HaNefesh. He even says Oisius have a higher shadish than Oyer, which is why they're Mamshech Eir, and so on. And he explains that you have separate oisius at each level of the nefesh. You have oisius of tainug, and oisius of rotzen, and oisius of chochmah, and oisius of bina, and oisius of midas, and oisius of machshava and mais. But then he says this: when a goof meets a neshama, it becomes a new entity. When oil meets keli, oil by itself is one thing, keli by itself is another thing. The joining of oil and keli is a third thing. And when oil meets keli, two things inevitably, invariably happen. A, the oil brings light into the keli and gives it life. And B, the keli brings gili into the oil and brings it down. Because there's a rule that every gili is a tzimtzum. Fal godo. So every time a neshama and a goof meet, the neshama's effect on the goof is that it comes to life, it raises it. And the goof's effect on the neshama is that it brings it down. The difference between one body and another is the ratio or the degree of influence of Oyer and Keli on Oyer. So Chassidus argues that in the higher levels of the Nefesh, Tainug, Ratz, Chochmah, even Pnimius Bina, when the Oyer meets Keli to produce a desire or a delight or an intuition of Chochmah or a deep understanding, a Pnimius understanding in Bina, there has to be a combination of Oisius and Eid, Guf and Neshama, Oid and Keli. Otherwise, the idea wouldn't exist, the feeling wouldn't exist, the intuition wouldn't exist, the will wouldn't exist. But there is so much Oid, the light is so strong, so powerful, that it almost feels like there's no words, there's no letters. It's only when you slow the Neshama down, on what's called the level of Chitzeni is Bina, the outer level of Bina, which is sometimes also called machshava thought, that you begin to notice that you're thinking with words. Think about an intellectual with a great mind. There's no way for anybody to think about anything without form. That form, that's the body that's carrying the ideas. But when you're very smart and you think very fast and you're thinking in the abstract, you're not paying attention to, so to speak, how you sound. You're simply paying attention to that there's an idea in your mind. So there's so many different levels in the neshama of Oid and Eisias. And in parallel, there's so many ideas, levels of, in the Lukus, in the Shtalshalus of Eid and Keli. But there's a demarcation, there's sort of a vertical line in the middle. All of the levels above, even though there's Eisias, they're so bottled to the Eid, you're not margish the Eid, the Kelim. And below that line, even though the Eid is mevatel the Keli somewhat, the Keli is sufficient to Metzias. In other words, the Keli has affected in the Eid a sufficient degree of Gili and Amshach Lamata that you see Eisias. And this explains obvious question. That is, that how could the not say this Eisias never level of the Neshama, when in Tanya, in the end of chapter 20, the Alter Rebbe elaborates in what seems like so many extra words. There's only Eisias in Machshava, there's Eisias in Dibur, and he makes the point. There's only Eisias in Machshava and Dibur. There's not Eisias in Medius, there's not Eisias in Sefer. And the teretz is, of course, there's Eisias in Seichel and Medius. There's no Eisias in Seichel and Medius, there's no Metzias in Seichel and Medius. But because the Eid is stronger, the Eisias are unfelt. The beginning of how does Alter Rebbe finish the Pedic? Eisias b'chol am, milshein am va'am, the languages of people, which means the words that people think and speak, that they actually are aware, not just of the ideas, but the actual enunciation of words. And the cutoff line is, like I said, from Pnimiyas Bina to Chitzoniyas Bina, or from a higher level of thought to a lower level of thought. If I needed to put it into concrete words, I would say when people think, there's two ways they think. They think about things theoretically, and they think about things practically. Or said differently, they think about things to understand them, and they think about things to revisit and to analyze and to see if they're correct, to test them. Thinking about things theoretically, there's also obviously words and letters. You can't think without images. But you're not margish the Eisias and the Eid, you're margish the Eisias and the Kelim, you're only margish the Eid. However, when you think about doing something, when you think about speaking it, like it says in Tanya Ve'ikaf at the end, the Eisias become more gush. So the truth is, first of all, Eisias ne'er mushish til atzmos. Eisias ne'er mushish til atzma nefesh. And in every single level, there is a Gilui Oid, which is juxtaposed against Eisias, which makes a Metzias of Tainug, a Metzias of Rotz, a Metzias of Chochma, a Metzias of Bina, etc., etc., etc. And in each case, the joining of Eid and Eisias creates a new Metzias, a new Gilui. On the higher levels, the Oid is Mavatal the Eisias more than the Eisias is Mamshech the Oid, and therefore you're Markish only Oid. At the lowest levels, especially in speech and even in thought, because the Oid is sufficiently reduced, you not only are aware of the idea that you're thinking, but the words in which you're thinking them, and certain ideas in which you're speaking them, because everybody understands that the whole medium of speech is to focus not just on what I'm saying, but how I'm saying it. You're actually focusing on the words. Okay, so Oid and Keli, Oisias and Oid, both come from Atzmos. They come from Atzmos through different systems, different principles, and they exist in every world. And according to Kabbalah and Chassidus, there's separate Oisias and Kelim for every single world and every level and type of Oisias in the Etzem. But on the higher levels, the Oid is Mevatel the Oisias, not Margish the Oisias, and the lower levels, the Oid is not Mevatel the Oisias. The Oisias is Magala the Oid, and you're Margish the Oisias. Which leads to one final point. And the final point, of course, is that if you can imagine the human neshama, an idea emerges from the neshama on a level of intuition. Then it comes down to an analysis. Then it comes down to a conclusion, which you're then going to feel in your heart, and then you're going to use your senses to appreciate, and then you're going to think about it, and you're actually going to do it. Each one of these different levels has different words to carry that same idea. There's the letters that carry the intuition of Chochmah, there's the letters that carry the previous of Bina, understanding the idea that's removed from emotion. There's a letter that carries in a level of understanding which is already leaning towards Chesed or Gevura. There's the letters that carry at the level of feeling, and letters that carry at the level of thought. In other words, thinking how I'm going to actually do it, and then the letters that actually speak it. Each one of these Oisias comes directly from Etzem Nefesh, and they're separate. But there's only one chain. In other words, when Oisias come from Machshava to Dibur, the Oisias HaDibur had to have been included in the Oisias of Machshava, or the Dvar Seichel. Because if they weren't, you wouldn't be able to speak. The Oisias of Machshava have to be included in the Oisias of the medius, otherwise you're not going to be able to think. The Oisias of the medius have to be included in the Oisias of Bina. otherwise we would not be able to emote. And the Oisius of Bina have to be included in the Oisius of Chochmah, otherwise not be able to analyze. The Oisius of Chochmah have to be included in the Oisius of Ratzon, otherwise not be able to intuit, etc., etc., etc. That's the meaning of Mehis Avos Ha'ed, as the Eid gets lower. Mishavim, Avos Eid Nasu Oisius, the Oisius come from the with an ayah, the thickening of the Eid. That the oil becomes less, so the goof, the oisius, are felt more. So even though in Yishtalshel it's only one pole, right? There's only one neshama that delivers many different forms, metaphysical and spiritual forms, physical forms, intellectual forms, emotional forms, sensual forms, behavioral forms. They all come from Etzem HaNefesh. But on the highest levels of the Nefesh, you already have the possibility for all the lower ideas and for all the lower oisius that are going to emerge from those ideas. But there's a difference. Let's say a teacher understands something at a very abstract level, and he teaches it to a brilliant student, and he teaches it to a less brilliant student, and then teaches it to a commoner. That original teacher has all the light of that idea that he has, that the brilliant student has, that the less brilliant student has, and that the masses have. That teacher has all of the letters and words needed to say the idea that he speaks to the brilliant teacher, and that brilliant teacher speaks to a teacher who's not so brilliant, who's going to teach to all of the students. But the way that brilliant teacher teaches it to an extraordinary student, you just hear one level. An abstract idea spoken in few very, very powerful words. All the lesser light and all the lesser words are hidden, but they're hidden in different ways. The lower ideas, as they're included in the higher ideas, are the higher idea. Like when you put two flames together, you have one greater flame. The lower words, as they're included in the higher words, are actually separate words. And they're just sort of sitting there waiting to be manifest if and when this great student will teach it to a lesser student. And that's the difference between the Oir system and the Kalim system. In the Oir system, a lower Eid in the higher word is the higher Eid. And in the Kalim and Oisius system, a lower Eid in a higher level exists distinctly, but you're not married. This is a review, an overview of Oisius. I spent about half an hour doing this. Okay? It's approximately a half an hour. I hope I didn't talk too fast. I think I covered it basically. My sources are the first couple of my modern Hemshech Ranat, and of course the Geras HaKedesh Siman Hey Vayaz David Shem from the Alter Rebbe in Tanya, which talks about all of these ideas. One more thing I want to discuss. Say a person delivers a concept, an intellectual idea, a metzius, seichel. So there are two basic things here. There's the enlightenment, the oil of the seichel, and there's the oisius. So according to Hasidus, everything is backwards. In the human experience, the most meaningful part of that idea is the light of the idea. The words are simply a medium to carry. But in the source, it's the other way around. Here's how. The letters themselves, the oisius themselves, are mushish and etzem mamish. The koyach hatziruf, which means the ability to join those letters and to create words, and to join those words and create sentences, and to join those sentences and create paragraphs, and so on, are mushish and chochmah. Koyach hatziruf is mushish and chochmah. The ability to join letters and consonants, sounds into words, and so on and so forth, as the shadish is higher than seichel. And the lowest idea is the seichel itself. So even though in Ishtalshus we see bodies, we see words, we see vessels as conduits, as mediums to hold light, life, ideas, but in the source, the oisius have a higher shadish. And ultimately, the shadish of all kelim and all oisius is in atzmos, and it comes down to this ishtalshalus in the way that I just explained. So, having done this, we're going to read the Maimon inside. It's not going to take us long. So I gave you my introduction, now we're going to learn it inside. Let me just repeat again what our Maimon is about. Start off by talking about the Abbas and the Moif, Mireish Tzurim and Moif. Abbas and the Moif are many miles, and they're the source of all the Jewish. Number two, if every Yid comes from every one of the Abbas, every one of the Mois, and Kaden LaAbbas, Ela LaShleisha, and Kaden LaMois, Ela LaBa, every mile that each one of the Abbas and the Mois have, every Jew possesses. Quote, you have to just reveal it. Right? Number three, if every Yid has every mile of the Abbas and the Mois down here, it has to exist in their source. And of course, the end of the Maimer is going to say that to bring it from a higher level to a lower level means going even higher. But in order to explain that every idea that obviously Mois have hidden, and they don't only have it down there, they have it in the Shadish Shemaka, and it's nimshach from that Shadish Shemaka till it comes down into this world, this Hishtalshalos that Rebbe gives the mushal of the way letters are mishtalshal from a higher level to a lower level. And remember, letters don't really begat, they're not babies. Letters of Machshava, they're not the letters of Dibur. Letters of Machshava come from Etzem. Letters of Dibur come from Etzem. Letters of medius come from Etzem. Letters of Seichel come from Etzem. Letters of Ratzon come from Etzem. But they're nishtalshal on the higher level, the oasis that are destined for the lower levels of the nefesh are hidden. And when you go to a lower oid, they begin to emerge. But the shadish is tilatzis. Let's read inside the Yuv on bottom of page Shinai and base. You have to understand the idea that everything that exists down here in Mishal Yisrael also exists in their source. Lamailo, Aliyah, the Gemoy, Shemaviyah Malzed, there's many Mishalim. To illustrate this, number one, Mikoichas, from the faculties of the Mishal, which means Seichel, and Midas, and Kush. This is Oyer, or Chayis, of the Mishal. And that's the more typical mashal. But the Rebbe doesn't give this mashal in this Maimer. He just mentions it, that there's the mashal of Kechas HaNefesh. And then he says, there's also the mashal of the goofs, the bodies, the letters, the vessels, the bodies that are going to carry these various different koiches. And he chooses to use the path of the mashal in this minor, not from Kechas HaNefesh, which is much more difficult, but from Eisias HaNefesh. Ula Hoyer says, Rebbe, excuse me. Thank you. Middle teacher. Says the Rebbe Lahoyev to add, Shabbos Chayim, let's say when Kabbalah we find, and look, there's no Maramokim, this is to be very significant. And again, it calls the United States. You're talking about the chain reaction of worlds. Moreover, closing the chain reaction of cities within one world, that you have Dugmu, Mashal, and Asis. Standard, they bring the Mashal, not of the levels of the Nefesh, meaning Dibur, Machshava, Midas, Seichel, Ratz, Dainu. But the letters that are going to carry those levels, Dibur, Machshava, Midas, Seichel, Ratz, Dainu. And then, of course, what it says in Kabbalah in very abstract words. Kams explain the Chassidus Baruch at length, but even using an additional mashal, even after Kabbalah explains Hishtalshlus using the mashal of Asias, you then have the mashal of Chassidus on the mashal of Kabbalah to understand better how the Hishtalshlus of Asias work. The standard mashal in Chassidus is the person. So Chassidus uses the mashal Kechas HaNefesh to explain the mashal of the Kabbalah of the Eitz Chayim of Oitzis. This is what it says here. Of course, why do we use the mashal of Kechas HaNefesh? Why do we use the mashal of Tzarech Zelaka? It's because the Shtalshal, it says in the Tanya in the beginning, that all of the aspects in the human condition come from those in Yonim as the Alamayla in the Sfiras Al Yenis. So in the Sfiras Al Yenis, you have the equivalent of every aspect that you have in the Nefesh Adam. Why? Because the Nefesh Adam was created in the image of the Adam Ha'el. So the Nefesh Adam is the perfect mashal for Lamayla, because we're in the image of Lamayla. Right? Like the Rebbe brings one of the early siches, and I mentioned it in one of my last classes, that there's a mashal mechuven and a mashal she'enim mechuven, a precise mashal and an imprecise mashal. The example of a precise mashal is using the Koiches HaNefesh to explain the Esses Sfiras. Because the Esses Sfiras came from the Koiches HaNefesh. And the mashal she'enim mechuven is you find a parallel in one aspect between one thing that's lower to explain something high. That mashal is imprecise. But the perfect mashalim in Kabbalah are as perfect as they are, because the nimshal came from the mashal, and therefore the nimshal brings the mashal closer to us and our understanding. So the Rebbe says, Chassidus uses the mashal Keches Hanef to explain what it says in Kisvi Arizal, the mashal of Asis. And the Rebbe chooses to use the mashal of Asis. Hamidis, Zog, Fishehem B'Chochma, the letters of the Midis as they're included in Chochma. And of course, Chochma is Abba Tzurim. The letters that are later going to become the expressions of how one feels, but the intuition of Chochma is only on a level that you're able to see it, not able to understand it, and certainly not able to feel it. Because the way the letters of Midas are included in Chochmah, they're not felt, they're not distinct, they're part of Chochmah. And therefore, our association to those letters as they're included in Chochmah, that you can anticipate them, you can see them in the future. Ralachas Kama V'Kama, and certainly the way the Oisius of Midas are included in Chochmah, it's not Be'efen Shel Eschalkus Echad Me'ashen, you can't see distinct aspects. Chesed B'fnei Atzmei, Gvura B'fnei Atzmei, Teferet B'fnei Atzmei. And again, I'm going to be loyal to this mind. It doesn't mean the oil of chesed and the oil of gevur. It means the oisius of chesed and the oisius of gevur. Yalderach zeh kol hashish and midas. The same is true in all 6 things. When they come to the actual midas, they're actually separate. So this mind is not talking so much about koiches. It's talking about oisius. The letters that are going to allow me to express an emotion exist in my chokhmah. And the way they exist in my Chochmah, first of all, the emotion isn't experienced. It's just anticipated, visualized. And it's not separated from other emotions. It's all included in one. And then later it comes down. In Chassidus, I talk about the difference between Midas in Bina and Midas in Chochmah. Midas in Bina is an opinion that's leading in one direction, a psak leading in one direction. Midas in Chochmah is just an intellectual intuition, intellectual feeling. It's not actually an intellectual opinion that speaks to din or to chesed. So the Rebbe says the letters that are going to carry this idea to the level of emotions exist in that idea as they're intuited at a level of Chochmah. But the degree of reality to those letters is just, I don't know, it's anticipatory. You can see it. And it's not divided up. And the example for this example is letters themselves. It may be true that letters emerge from Chochmah, like it says in Kabbalah based on the Zayah. Abba Yosef Barata, the father, which is Chochmah, creates the daughter, which is Malchus, which is Libu, which is Asis. The Seidim says that in the bracket, moreover, Shamita Sametzias Shal Asis, the true source of Asis. And he uses the word Metzias. But it doesn't mean the word Metzias in terms of form, which is how I usually translate the word. The term is in terms of existence. The existence of Asis doesn't begin when an idea is created. It exists in it. It's even above Chochmah, and he uses the classic language. Letters are rooted all the way to Etzem HaNefesh, like it says in Geras HaKedesh. Etzem HaNefesh Malaya Oisius. Then look at footnote 27, and he refers you to Seif Maimorim Tafrei Tzadik Vav, page 110. We looked this up when we learned the Maimed of Toshin Gimel Shvuos. I'm not going to do it now. And we discovered that the source of this statement, the Nefesh Asma Malaya Oisius, is the Alter Rebbe, not earlier. Which of course makes this very choshev. When you have an Indian Chassidus, when I'm saying in this which is not from Kabbalah, this is Mamish Rebbe Sazah. So it's Karev Lanu, so it's Yakar Lanu, this idea. So it may be true that when I take an idea from an intuitive level to a thorough and analytical level, and then to a level where I can respond to it emotionally, and then where I can struggle to bring it into action and then think about doing it, and actually doing it. When I had that intuition in my mind, the idea that will later develop from step to step in the nefesh exists theoretically in that intuition. And the words that are going to carry that idea from world to world also exist in a hidden way in intuition. But there's a big difference. The idea as it exists, level of intuition, the lesser lights, the light of analysis and understanding, the light of feeling, the light of struggling to make it practical, the light of thinking it, are all one light, as they are in the higher source. The letters that are going to carry that light are distinct letters. In the Chokhmah, there's already separately Aces of Pnimi and Bina, and Aces of Chitzeni and Bina, Aces of Chagas, and Aces of Nehi, and Aces of Machshava, and Aces of Dibur, separately. Because the real source of Aces is Etzem HaNeshama. They're just going to show themselves as the light diminishes, a lower level of Aces emerge. There are distinct letters already existing in the Chokhmah that are going to account for the Bina and for the medius and for the Nehi, for the Machshava and for the Dibur. It's only that as Be'efen Shalanika Klal Aces, you can't see the letters at all. But you say there's no form to these letters whatsoever, but not there's no form to the letters that they don't exist. There's no form to the letters even though they exist, because the Hizbatlas Hayadei Ha'ed, which is how the Kalim and Oisius system is different than the Oid and Chayis system. Then, when those emotions that exist on a level of vision in Chochmah come down to the level of Bina, which is called Mevois Ashurenu, which is the level of understanding, analysis, and understanding. It's much more deliberate. It's much more departmentalized. So you're understanding an idea, and now you actually have an opinion of Netiyah, the Chesed, and the Gvura, which is much closer to an actual emotion. So the light and the letters that are going to be emerging when you're actually going to feel are closer to being revealed, even though they're not revealed yet. And therefore it says the voice Ashurenu. Ashurenu is oftentimes explained also as to see. But the Rebbe wants to separate Bereish Surim Enu, in other words, from Chochmah you have a relationship to lower, only that you could see it. And Mevois Ashurenu, that Bina you have a closer relationship to what's going to be later, even though it's hidden. So therefore, he translates the word Ashurenu, Kemekenin, Ashurai, preparing one's steps. Ashurenu means that you're already emerging. Like I said, Rashi says Ashen also means to see, and it means Rayas. But the Rebbe holds Arenu means I anticipate. Ashurenu means I'm beginning to go towards it. In comparison, relative to, when measured against, how the emotions are going to existed in the Diyah Chochmah, versus how they existed in the Havana, the China, or Bina, they're much closer to being real, because you're emerging from hidden to revealed in steps. Shesh Kvar HaKorah, there's already an evident Netiyah L'Chesed of leaning to kindness or to the opposite, that there's not actual a verdict on a level where you feel kindness, where you feel exacted to, says the Rebbe, nevertheless, there's already Netiyah Sichlis, leaning towards Chesed. In Chochmah, there's the Oid. In abstraction includes the possibility of Netiyah Chesed and Gvura, and the Netiyah Chesed and Gvura are one. In other words, the Oid HaChochmah includes the enlightenment which could become Chesed and could become Gvura in one abstract Oid. And in Bina, they're separate. Now that was the Be'esis thing is true in the letters that carry the Bina. When the words and letters, the body, which carries the intellectual and level of Bina, which is analytical and thorough, come down to the level of Chochmah, to the level of Bina. Even though in Bina you still only have ideas, you don't yet have feeling. And you hear and see and feel only ideas. Is in the level of Bina, the letters that are going to later emerge. When one is going to feel the Netiyah are beginning to emerge, they have some kind of a form and an expression in Bina. Is only primarily you feel it. In Chochmah, the Aces are not felt at all, just to the ear. In Bina, they're beginning to be felt, even though the Eid is preeminent and dominant. So you get the picture. All lower levels exist in higher levels. In Oid in its way, and in Aces in its way. And as you're coming from higher to lower, even what is even lower, that's not yet emerged, is closer to its own emergence than the way it was in Chochmah. Then it comes down to actual feeling, which is the Shisha Midis. And here the Rebbe says, in Aces, mamish. And again, when it says here Aces mamish, I presume it means Aces like it says in Tanya Perek Hof, because they're already talking about Machshava, or Chitzeni is Bina. And then, of course, when Neisif was that, in addition to all of this, Yeshna, There's a lower level still, which brings the idea and the words to outside the person altogether, which is the letters of speech, like the feature medius. When one is speaking, it's much lower the way one is feeling and thinking. And it's also to the Adam Atzmin, it's not a Labush Mashenkin. So when a person speaks, you're focusing on the words, and the words become the medium to carry the ideas. In thought, you're focusing on the ideas, and the ideas are brought forth through the words. But machshava is the beginning of the. So that's it. We're done. We read a haskalah, mamish, a haskalah, a philosophy about the hishtalshos of Aces. Now, I read it and I translated it. You could read it and translate differently and say that I'm, as they say in Yiddish, beating a kettle. But I'm trying to be consistent to how the Rebbe started the Peirik, that he wants to use the mashal of the hishtalshos of Aces, not the mashal of the hishtalshos of Aces. When the Eid of Chacham comes into Bina, it's literally a little piece of that Eid becoming Bina. When the Eid of Bina comes into Midas, it's literally a little piece of that Eid becoming Midas. When the Eid of Chacham produces ACS Abina, it's different ACS. They just reveal from a hidden state to a revealed state because of the Tzimtzum of Chacham. When the ACS of Bina produces ACS of Midas and of Dibur, it's the same thing. Because in the ACS system, the higher level isn't creating the lower level, it's simply diminishing itself to allow the lower level to emerge. And the same is true with Yidden, that every mile they have Lamata, they have Lamaila, and as you go from Lamaila to Lamata, they emerge. Why does the Rebbe choose to use the Mashal of Oisius, which is unusual, rather than the Ois of Keches HaNefesh, which is far more typical? I'm not going to say, because I don't know. But I hope I've led you through this background to a point where you can decide for yourself what this means. Okay, this is the end of a Magid. This is important. This is going to be Mashlim. And we'll see what happens going forward.